Check one, check one.
Does that sound okay? Does that sound okay?
We're online.
We're online. Excellent. All right, crew, get your pizza, get a drink, sit down. We're going to get started.
Don't worry about it.
Oh, that's crooked. Oh, I see him. The Heims are here. We were worried that y'all got lost between your house and here. Yeah. Guys, there's pizza over here in the corner if you're hungry. All right, is this everybody? We're going to assume so. All right, welcome back. Welcome to our third How to Study the Bible class. Garrett, are you okay? All right, good deal. Okay, so today we're going to not really mix it up. We're keeping the same format, but I'm going to kind of pull back and go a little bit slower. We're going to have a little bit more time for discussion and questions today because I realize the past two sessions have been just information overload. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to kind of process what we've talked about. If you have questions that have been lingering from the past two sessions or from anything we talk about today, we're going to have plenty of time to talk about those things. We are on our timeline. We're still going to be in the patriarchs today. We might get into the Exodus just a little bit depending on how our conversation goes. But if you guys remember, I'm caught in my microphone. We have covered creation. So we covered the Garden of Eden, the fall. We covered the Noahic covenant, which is where God promises he's not going to destroy the world ever again. And then last session, we really talked about Abraham the whole time, and we talked about the Abrahamic covenant. Now, does anybody remember what the promises of the Abrahamic covenant were?
His family will be as sparse as the stars in the sky.
As numerous as the stars in the sky.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. Yes, that was one of them, yes. Matthew. Land?
Promised land was part of Abraham.
Yes. Land was a big part of it. So good, those were two big ones. So there were kind of like three major blessings in the Abrahamic covenant. They were offspring for Abraham, that they were going to be as numerous as the stars. It was going to be that God was going to provide a land for Abraham and his offspring to live in, and those offspring would form a nation that would one day be a blessing to all people all over the world. So those were like the big three blessings of that covenant. And do you guys remember how that covenant kind of played out a little bit, like what it looked like?
Wasn't there like this trail of blood at one time?
A trail of blood, yeah. It looked like this, right?
Yeah.
Remember this picture?
There it is.
Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah.
We want.
Blood and gore. That's what we're here for. Yeah. Right. So this is what our Abrahamic covenant looked like when it was being established. And this was common, remember, of covenants of that time. You cut animals in half. You walk through the middle of that trail of blood to solidify that covenant, you and the other covenant partner. But what does God do in the case of Abraham?
Sends him into a deep sleep
Yes. For what reason?
in order to only place the deal on God's behalf, so
Yeah.
that way the covenant could not be broken.
Excellent.
Because God keeps his promises no matter what.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you, Kane, for paying attention. Yes. That's exactly what happened. So God put Abraham in a deep sleep, so he could not walk through the middle of this covenant. Only God walked through the middle of it, or he floated as a flame through the middle of it, to solidify the fact that God was in control of this thing, and it was not dependent on Abraham fulfilling any sort of like obligation to God in order for this promise to come true. Now, when we move into the Mosaic Covenant, we're going to see that changes, and we are going to get some stipulations, but this Abrahamic covenant sets the foundation for all the other covenants that we're going to talk about going forward, for the Mosaic one, for the Davidic one, for especially the new covenant. It's all going to come back to the things that we have learned about this Abrahamic covenant. Yes, Kane.
I just want you to notice
Oh,
that,
did you want that? Sure.
I don't know if you guys have noticed that whenever we were younger, we would portray death as with your tongue sticking out.
Yeah.
And the ram right there has its
No.
tongue just sticking out.
There you go. There you go.
Uh-oh.
He's dead.
When we used to like cut the necks off the sheep.
He is dead, yeah. You guys remember that when you were young doing that? Okay. All right, so here we are. So last time we left off,
I love Minecraft.
hey, one conversation, come on. Last time we left off, and Abraham had just passed his test of faith, right? He had put Isaac up on the altar, but he doesn't have to kill Isaac because God provides the ram instead of Isaac. And what did we talk about? Isaac represents what? He's not just up there trying to kill his son. What is it? If he kills Isaac, what is he killing?
Faith.
Yeah,
Faith.
the sign of Abraham's faith, undying faith in God. He
And-
questioned God's command and God told him, you need to sacrifice your son.
Yes, so it is a test of faith for Abraham for sure. And we talked about how Isaac is the covenantal heir. Remember? So the original blessing goes to Abraham, but the blessing is going to go through Abraham's seed. Remember how we talked about in Genesis 3:15, there's that seed of man who's going to crush the serpent. This is the line, this is the seed that we're following through this all of these classes. And this is where we're at. So we followed the seed, we followed it from Seth to Noah to Shem to Abraham down to Isaac. So this is the line that Jesus is going to end up coming through, okay? So when we left Isaac and Abraham, Isaac had just gotten off the altar. He has been established as the covenantal heir of this Abrahamic covenant. He is going to be the next main person in line. Now, in order to get us to the next covenant, to the Mosaic Covenant, which is the next big one, I'm going to kind of cliff notes us through the rest of Genesis so we have time to talk and discuss. So we had Isaac. Isaac actually doesn't really have a whole lot of storyline to him. He's not quite as prolific as Abraham is, and so once Isaac comes down off the altar, we just get a story basically about him going to find his wife or sending a servant to find his wife. And that's really all we hear about him until he is old enough to get married and have children. And that's where we're going to pick up our story, is with Isaac. He marries his wife Rebecca, and I spelled her name wrong because it's with a K in the actual Bible. And we're going to pick up with Esau and Jacob, because those are Jacob is our next covenantal heir. So we're not going to read a ton of these stories, but I do want you to kind of open your Bible so I can point out where things are. So if you do want to go back and read them more in depth, you can do that. So we left off in Genesis. We left off on Genesis 22. And this is the Abraham's faith tested with Isaac on the altar. Right after this, Sarah, Abraham's wife, dies. Abraham remarries and has more children. Because remember, we talked about in the last class too, how Abraham is not just considered the forefather of Christianity. He's considered a forefather of Islam and Judaism as well. And we see the line of Islam come through Ishmael. And just like a little tangent here, when we talk about like the Middle East now, like Israel, Jerusalem, the Palestine area, all of those conflicts come back to Abraham, to this land that Abraham is on, and how Ishmael has a claim to it, and the descendants of Isaac have a claim to it. So those are the Christians and the Arabs fighting over the same land. They have been doing this for thousands of years. We're still doing this. So this is land that is sacred. Do it.
The Crusades?
I'm not real sure where the Crusades were, to be honest with you. I think it's that general territory, but I don't know if it was specifically Jerusalem. Maybe. I don't know. It's not really my area of expertise. Okay, anyway. All right, so Sarah's died, Abraham's remarried, he's had more children. We get, in Genesis 24, you get the story of Isaac getting his wife Rebecca. Interesting little note here, Rebecca, like Sarah, Abraham's wife, is also barren. She's unable to have children. And so now we've got our second major matriarch in this covenantal line who can't produce children on her own. So I want you guys to kind of tuck that the way back of your head, because we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. We're going to pick up, though, with Genesis 25. This is where, so Abraham dies, and our story shifts to Isaac and his children. And we're going to go to the births of Esau and Jacob. And let's read just 25:19 through 26. Will somebody read that for us? Do what? Whoever wants to.
I want to.
Go, Tyler.
19 to what?
26.
This is the account of the family of Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel of the from Adam, and the sister of Laban.
Armenian.
Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with him. The two children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to ask the Lord about it. Why is this happening to me, she asked. And the Lord told her, the son in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger. And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at first, and covered with thick hair like a bird's eye. So they named him Esau. Then another son was born with this hand, grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. Isaac was 6 years old when the twins were born.
Thank you. Okay, so here's our next major characters. They've just been born. They're twins. Esau is the older one. But what does God tell Rebekah is going to be the situation with these two? Other way around. Oh, wait, no, that's right. You're right. Sorry, Matthew's right. Yes, you're right. Yes, the older one's going to serve the younger one. And so like we saw God kind of doing with Abraham when he kind of started establishing the covenant before, he's foreshadowing what we're about to read. And so we're going to read several stories, or talk about several stories here about what happens to put Jacob over Esau, even though he's the younger son. Because birth order in the ancient Near East was a big deal. If you were the firstborn son, even if you were just like a few minutes or a few seconds older, you were still the firstborn son. And with that came a lot of rights and privileges that your other siblings didn't have. So this is a big deal that Jacob is going to rule over his brother. So if you've got the little, well, you've all got the stars because you're all reading the same Bible. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see that Esau means hairy, which is funny. It's a little red, hairy dude. And then what does Jacob's name mean? Look down at the very bottom. Deceiver.
Deceiver?
Right.
I know people named Jacob. That's a little worried.
Yeah. So you can tell them, hey, do you know that your name means deceiver? Uh-huh.
No.
Exactly.
Everybody can Jacob. He may have been deceiving you.
Because I've done them before. They're not very nice.
Okay, so we see, like from the get-go, that we can probably already kind of establish a little bit of character for Jacob and where these stories are going to go, right? So if you look just straight down under what we just read, it says Esau sells his birthright. And this is just a story where Jacob deceives his brother Esau out of his birthright. So Esau is out hunting. He comes home. He's like, I'm starving. He's probably not really starving, but he thinks he's starving. And Jacob has just made this stew for him, right? And so Jacob says, I'll give you the stew if you'll give me your birthright. And Esau, being the brilliant brother that he is like, okay, fine, let's do this. And so he gives over his birthright. So that means he is giving over basically his right to be the firstborn son. Now, this is not the same as the covenantal blessing. We'll talk about where that comes into effect later. So Esau was not established as the next covenantal heir. That is not what God is saying up in those verses above. And so here we see that Esau is giving away that birthright. He's giving away the promise to the land, to the livestock, to ruling over the family once Isaac has passed away. And he gives it away over a bowl of soup. So we see like both sides of this coin are kind of shady here. Jacob is willing to deceive his brother for something that's not rightfully his. Esau is willing to give something that is very important up for a bowl of soup. And it even says in verse 34, if you look all the way down, it says that Esau showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. So we're going back to those heart issues that we've been talking about all the way through Genesis, about like Cain and Abel. It's like where that like seed of sin starts and how it sort of affects people in God's plan, and how God is constantly having to like work with these people and get things back on track. Okay, so we get this story, and then right over in chapter 27, we see that neither brother has learned their lesson, and Jacob then steals Esau's blessing from him. This, again, is also not the covenantal blessing. This is a blessing that was just given to the children by their father when they were about to pass away. So these were not considered like prophecies or anything that was set in stone, but they did culturally bear a lot of weight. And people felt like, this is like a good way to measure how your dad really felt about you, was what kind of blessing he gave you right before he died. And so typically it's one to prosper, one to like grow the land and your offspring and all those kind of things. And we see in 27 that Jacob deceives Isaac at this time. Does anybody want to read? This is kind of a fun story. Let's read 27, 1 through... I don't want to read the whole thing. Hang on. Let's read 1 through 27.
I can do it.
Okay.
One day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called to Esau, his older son, and said, "My son." "Yes, father," he replied. I am an old man now," Isaac said, "and I don't know when I may die. Take your bow and a quiver full of arrows and go out into the open country and to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare my favorite dish and bring it here for me to eat. Then I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die." But Rebekah overheard what Isaac had said to his son Esau, and when Esau left to hunt for the wild game, she said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I overheard what your father said to Esau. Bring me some wild game and prepare me a delicious meal. Then I will bless you in the Lord's presence before I die. Now, my son, listen to me. Do exactly as I tell you. Go out to the flocks and bring me 2 fine young goats. I'll use them to prepare your father's favorite dish. Then take the food to your father so he can eat it and bless you before he dies." "But look," Jacob replied to Rebekah, "my brother Esau is a hairy man and my skin is smooth. What if my father touches me? He'll see that I'm trying to trick him and he'll curse me instead of blessing me." But his mother replied, "Then let the curse fall on me, my son. Just do what I tell you, and go out and get the goats for me." So Jacob went out and got the young goats for his mother. Rebekah took them and prepared a delicious meal just the way Isaac liked it. Then she took Esau's favorite clothes, which were there in the house, and gave them to her younger son Jacob. She covered his arms and the smooth part of his neck with the skin of the young goats. Then she gave Jacob the delicious meal, including freshly baked bread. So Jacob took the food to his father and said, "My father?" he said. "Yes, my son," Isaac answered. "Who are you, Esau or Jacob?" Jacob replied, "It's Esau, your firstborn son. I've done as you told me. Here's the wild game. Now sit up and eat it so you can give me your blessing." Isaac said, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" The Lord your God put it in my path," Jacob replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come closer so I can touch you and make sure you are really Esau." So Jacob went closer to his father, and Isaac touched him. "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's," Isaac said. He did not recognize Jacob because Jacob's hands felt hairy like Esau's. So Isaac prepared to bless Jacob. "But are you really my son, Esau?" he asked. "Yes, I am," Jacob replied. Then Isaac said, "Now, my son, bring me the wild game. Let me eat it, and then I will give you my blessing." So Jacob took the food to his father, and Isaac ate it. He also drank the wine that Jacob served him. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come a little closer and kiss me, my son."
Okay, thank you. You're good right there. So from there, Jacob just goes on and he blesses Isaac goes on, he blesses Jacob and kind of gives him this blessing of having offspring and land, very similar to what our covenant blessing is, but again, they're different. So here we have like Jacob, again, being kind of classic deceiver Jacob mode. Isaac is very old, he's blind, he's on his deathbed, and this is the time that he should be imparting his blessings on his children. And so Esau, again, as the firstborn son, is entitled to like the best blessing. And Rebekah, his mom, their mom, loves Jacob a little bit more, so she sort of finagles this so that Jacob is the one who ends up getting this blessing. And they do it through this very deceitful way of, and like really weird way of putting, like gluing goat fur onto Jacob.
That's not right.
Yeah, right? It is one of those moments where you're like, man, Isaac must have been really poor, like bad off in order to be fooled by this. But here we go. Here we have our covenantal heir. We don't know he's the covenantal heir yet, but that's where this is going, acting in a deceptive way. And we saw this with his great-grandfather, right? Abraham, also kind of a shady guy at times, right? He ends up passing that faith test at the end, but there's several times he tries to give Sarah away as his sister. And then if you look in between these two stories that we just read about Jacob and Esau, there's a story in the middle about their father, Isaac, who does the exact same thing with his wife, Rebekah, and tries to pass her off as his sister to a Palestinian king named Abimelech. So like, this is like a family trait, this deceptive thing, until we even get to Jacob, where his name literally means deception. Sorry. So while I choke on this water, I want you guys to get together in groups of like 2 or 3 and talk about why these guys. So we've talked about Abraham, we've talked about Isaac, and now we're on to Jacob. We've seen that they are all morally flawed characters. Why are these our patriarchs? Why are these the guys that God chose? So take like a couple minutes with your people who are just right around you and talk about why you think that would be the case.
God likes to be really powerful, and He likes to use the people you would not take. So He uses deceiving people and actually just them.
You have no one else.
God.
She's gonna turn it towards you anyway, man.
He disappeared. Quite short.
See? Jeez, Garrett, said it all. Come to your breath away, man. Can you repeat the question again?
Yes. Why are these the guys that God chose to work through with this covenant? Why not pick some like super morally righteous do-gooders and have those be the guys? Why did these guys end up being our patriarchs? Just poor selection choices.
These people was the last resort. I was like, I can't find it. I was like,
I know. It's like I wiped everybody else with a flood. I'm down to some small numbers here.
Well, other than that, I think these are the guys that are like in the covenant because, I mean, no one really believed in Noah. Like, I mean, no one had faith in Noah. He said that the earth is going to flood. So they didn't believe him, but the earth ended up flooding with everybody except for Noah. And then, I mean, they're part of like line of life. I mean, God had this whole thing planned. Like, God was going to Jesus was going to come down to the earth and sacrifice his son. And he needed to be a part of a specific lineage.
All right, we get some answers. Who wants to give me your take on what this is all about? Come on. All right, Matthew. Wait, did we miss somebody? Wait, somebody walk out the door? Hang on. All right, okay. Matthew, go for it.
Okay.
What did you guys come up with?
Well, Jesus, which is pretty far down the line, like really, really far. But Jesus needed to be part of a specific lineage of
Okay.
age. So, and geez, my brain's not working. Esau and Jacob are part of that lineage, and one of them's not so wise. Jacob, he's the deceiver, so he's obviously gonna like do his best. And I'm kind of confused on why Rebecca wanted Jacob to be there. but Jesus needed to be part of a specific lineage, and in
Okay.
order for that to be possible, Jacob had to be the one to be in that covenant, not Esau.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. So, I mean, basically, God chose this family is reason number one, and this is the family Jesus comes through. So, no matter what they do, God has promised, right, that he's going to fulfill this covenant. So, in some aspects, it doesn't really matter how shady they are, because God has already promised that this is who this family is, and these are the people he's going to work with. And we know God is faithful above all things, so he is going to work with these situations. Garrett, what did you have?
I first thought it was because, similar to how God used the shepherds to spread his word, he used like the people you last expect
Okay.
to kind of show like his power. He'd do things like, they expected Jesus to appear as like a sort of king, but he arrived on a mule. So I thought it was one of those situations where he used the people that you wouldn't think be capable of good for some of his amazing his works.
Good. Yeah, right? So, I mean, everybody's flawed, right? Now, granted, some of us are flawed more than others as far as, like, some moral character goes. But, it was going to be pretty slim pickings trying to find a purely righteous family line that was going to stay righteous all the way down, for one thing. And that really wasn't even God's intent when he established this covenant anyway, because that was the reason he put Abraham to sleep in the first place, was because it wasn't dependent on Abraham or his offspring being morally righteous in order for this covenant to be fulfilled. And so, like Garrett said, we see this is a theme throughout the whole Bible, right? God picks unlikely people to serve his purposes. And we're going to get to, like, David down the line, who is the best king Israel has ever seen. But what is the story that really David, other than David and the Goliath, what is the other story he's really known for? Anybody know?
Dancing in the streets naked.
No. David's other big story is that he is Bathsheba. He has an affair with a married woman and has her husband killed. This is also not like somebody you would point to immediately and be like, that's a righteous guy. But he in the Bible is called a man being after God's own heart, and he is through another covenant that we will see established. So I think one of the things that we are learning about God, especially with these like early patriarchs, is that it's not about them, right? Like if Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had been the most morally straight-laced, righteous guys on the planet, who would have gotten credit for this covenant working out? Would it have been God?
No, it would have been them.
Right. We would have looked at them and said, oh, well, of course, Abraham was perfect. Like, that's the reason this worked out. Where that's not the case here at all, right? And that is not the case that God works with, especially when we get to the Israelites. We see that we are getting these morally flawed characters because these stories ultimately are not about these guys. It's not about Abraham. It's not about Isaac. It's not about Jacob. These could have been any ancient Near East guys that God chose to pick. It's about God. It's about God's nature. It's about how God is faithful to his promises. And even though we see these guys continually pushing up against what God's plan is, he is going to fulfill these covenant promises to them because he is God and he said he is going to fulfill these covenant promises to them. And that was like the whole deal with him walking through the middle of the covenant, or the animal bodies, and Abraham not being able to. All of the responsibility is on him. Okay, so we've got Jacob, our deceiver. Isaac has figured out that Jacob has deceived him and that he's blessed the wrong son. He does end up blessing Esau too, but if you want to go back and look at it some other time, his blessing to Esau is not great. In fact, he says like he's going to live by the sword and that his brother is going to rule over him. But eventually he does give Esau sort of like this like glimmer of hope, because he tells Esau, eventually you're going to like shed that yoke and your brother won't rule over you anymore. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the next couple of chapters, because Jacob ends up having to flee from Esau's wrath, basically. They kind of play it off like he's going back to Abraham's homeland to find a wife, but it's really because Esau's going to kill him if he finds him. And we know from the previous stories that any time one of our main characters leaves that promised land, good things are probably not going to happen to them, right? So we do get a couple of interesting stories that happen to Jacob before he gets back to that land. One of them is that he has a dream where he sees a stairway to heaven, and there are angels going up and down it. We sometimes call it Jacob's ladder or the stairway to heaven. Yes, it's angels going up and down. Yes. And so, and it's in, like, after he has this dream and he wakes up, this is when our covenantal promise is actually bestowed on Jacob. So if you go to Genesis 28 and look at verse 13. So Jacob has just seen the stairway. At the top of the stairway is God. And he says, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. The ground you are lying on belongs to you. I am giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. Now that sounds really familiar, right? He said the same thing to Abraham pretty much, just a few chapters before. It's because this is where Jacob is actually getting that covenantal blessing passed on to him. This is where we officially know that Jacob is our covenantal heir, and we're going to follow the seed line through him now. Okay, so after this, after he becomes the official covenantal heir, he goes back to his family's land. We get this like long exchange where he falls in love with one of his cousins, because that's who you fell in love with back then. And the one he wants, though, is the younger sister. And he says that he will work for 7 years. He tells his uncle he'll work for 7 years for this sister. And that's the kind of arrangement they make. But then his uncle is Laban. Laban chooses to deceive Jacob. So we get a little bit of twist in the story here. Jacob's not our deceiver anymore. He's been honest. He's been working his 7 years for the younger daughter, Rachel. And they go to get married. And Laban has him marry Leah. Now, he doesn't know who he's marrying. And you're like, well, how does he not know who he's marrying? But the brides back then wore like big veils over their face. You couldn't see who you were actually marrying. You just kind of had to trust that the person they put in front of you was who you were told you were marrying. So surprise, it's not the one that he was working for. It's her older sister, Leah. He does not love Leah, and that's going to end up being an issue down the road. So he ends up working 7 more years for Rachel. And so he's done 14 years of work, ended up with 2 wives. And as we know from the Abraham story, so we've got a lot of mirroring happening here. When you end up with 2 women competing for the same man, things go awry. Remember the story of Sarah and Hagar and how that ended up with like a whole thing where Hagar and Ishmael got sent out into the desert, and now we have the religion of Islam. So this whole relationship between Leah and Rachel is going to be an issue going forward too. But what does happen is God is fulfilling his promises that he has promised Abraham. Jacob comes back to the land. He reunites with Esau. He actually ends up bowing down before Esau and apologizing to him for deceiving him. And sort of like, this is where we have like Jacob has his like really good like moment of moral character growth. We see him sort of righting some of those wrongs. And he's kind of like Abraham does. He kind of finally steps up into that space of who you would hope our patriarchs are, right? The way you hope that they would act. He's sort of undoing some of that ugliness he had done before. But, so again, Leah Rachel still an issue. He ends up having lots and lots of kids. He has some with Leah. He has some with Rachel. He has both of those ladies give him their handmaids who he marries, and he has children with them too. And so he ends up with 11 sons before we move into the next story. And that is the story of Joseph. Now, and interestingly, also, Rachel is also barren. So here is our 3rd matriarch in a row who cannot have children on her own. So that's going to be our next question. I want you to take a minute, get back with those people you're talking about. What is the deal with the barren women? If one of the covenantal promises is offspring, is multitudes, is nation building, why are the women barren?
Or I mean, Mary was barren, so you could have someone to do. Well, no, she's a virgin. Never mind.
She's a virgin.
It's not barren women.
I figured
Rachel.
Rachel are the ones that are barren.
Oh, I messed with the focus. there.
Yeah, we've had 3 in a row. Which one? Leah is not barren. She is unloved, is what it says. But she is capable of having children.
Okay, so Sarah, both Sarah and Rebecca had. Thank you.
Yeah.
Both.
So this Leah and Rachel.
Well, there goes that theory.
Yeah.
I was about to say, wait, maybe it has something to do with the women who were barren and had to have assistance from God gave birth to the I'm just gonna call him the golden child.
The golden child.
Like, at all. Like, that's all I can think of. But like they're golden, but Leah, of course, Leah has to come around. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, yeah, that throws that theory off. Okay, who has a thought on what the deal is with all the barren women? Anthony.
I don't know like how it rests, but like my like immediate idea was just like ask this someone with like the Virgin Mary.
Okay.
They come from like
Okay. I mean, there definitely is a correlation there, right? Because God gives Mary Jesus. But why do we think, like, what is the point? Think about the last question we just answered. I mean, it's a very similar answer, to be honest with you. Like, if you are God.
to show God's power.
Yeah. There you go. And it's, I mean, yes, it's about showing God's power, but it's also about making it very clear that these blessings, the covenant blessings, come from God. They are not random. They are not accidental. These people could not have done it on their own. Abraham and Sarah could not produce a covenantal heir on their own. Neither could Isaac and Rebekah. Neither could Jacob, and it will be Leah who the line goes through.
Well, I mean, Leah did. I mean.
Yeah, you're right. Rachel doesn't produce the covenant heir. That goes through Leah. But the promise of these offspring, these growing lines, these come from God. And like the whole thing goes back to the blessings are from God and not from their own doings. So we're going to take, before we kind of cover the rest of Genesis, which is just going to be very brief, let's take a break for like 5 minutes, get food, go to the bathroom. And then when we come back, if you have any questions of anything we've talked about so far, even back to the creation stuff, let's talk about those before we move on to the Mosaic stuff. But let's take a break first. Let everybody go do their thing. And then think about if you have questions, come back to me with your questions.
I don't know where Kane told me he was going to the bathroom.
Oh, I thought somebody left.
I did what?
He's 15 minutes ago.
Do we have a boy that can go check for him? Let's see.
He's coming back.
Can you go look for him? Make sure he's okay.
I'm going on an investigation.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I thought somebody got up, and I was like, did I get up?
No, he turned. What? Yep.
Yeah, but they edit it, like, so they'll edit out the break. It's not like live on YouTube. They'll post it later. You're fine. I don't know what it would matter though, even if they did see you all walking across the camera. It's hot in here.
I promise there's nothing wrong.
It's still in the bag.
I don't want to. Yo, can I have one?
It's for later.
No. Actually, yeah, I don't really care. I put it next to I love that. No more. Wow. They respect me more.
That is kind of true.
That is true. Then again, it
I
makes
don't
sense.
respect him at all.
That's
Mission successful. He was in the bathroom. He said if someone just wasn't
Thank you, Matt.
Oh boy, let me grab a plate. Let's hope there's not any tape underneath.
Try the next one.
I can move.
Next plate.
No, this way.
Did you remove the tape?
I didn't.
What?
You're stunned.
Yeah, the last night.
Where's the tape?
You're You okay?
When left.
After church. Yeah, I got it
They're
here.
both empty.
That is my
The
Bible.
Pastor Steve did it. It's like,
Yeah, it's just the
it's how I get hired.
Which one had a dog?
Let's check.
By pastor.
Yes, I did.
Wow.
Wow. That was for last week's lesson.
Oh, Garrett,
It
what?
was like,
I
yeah.
don't need one of those.
There's none in those boxes,
so. That thing is cold. No, this one. Never mind, that is cold. I'm surprised it's so cold. Wait, that was the what?
It's like a gusher.
You haven't. It's so gross. No, I don't.
I tried sparkling water.
Yeah,
I tried like
It'll fit.
my mom and dad brought
It'll
home
fit.
sparkling water.
There's only like 6
No water. It tastes
Yeah,
like
I got it.
Well, I
It's like watered down.
it has no sugar. It's like that's like a problem. If it had something I might like.
Garrett, I have.
Bubble. That's what's called. Bubble. That's
It looks like. Wait, no, I said piece.
No, there's like lots of
almost
them.
No one ever said pecan.
No, I mean, that's what
I've not tried it. Like those.
Yes? Ew!
Well, let's find out.
You never got curious.
my best.
I promise I'm not. But you know it.
Garrett, are you telling me you never got curious? I mean, I have, but still.
Thank you, Leo.
What with you guys?
What, aim to?
Why did you like, no, like, I don't talk
You don't have a problem
about
with them.
Dude, well,
This is like, you shouldn't come.
look at how small it is.
Well, I did,
That's very dramatic.
The camera's not solid. I'm gonna tell them to leave
Hey, you know how you're asking me about Leah? So it says in 31, it says that Leah was unloved. He enabled her to have children. I don't know if that means that she was barren or not, but it does imply that God is the one that enabled her to have children. So,
Okay, so I just meant you using entirely.
yeah, you may be right there. Yeah. So, because like you're saying, like the covenant comes through her, this line. So I think maybe you had a good point there about that's who it has to come through.
Did you say this? He's like, yeah. And he said,
yeah.
All right, everybody back. We missed anybody? Okay, what questions do we have? Anybody? Bueller? All right, hey, let's get started again. Woo, woo. Up here.
Just grab a microphone.
I know, I feel it's a lot of talking, guys. I can't get louder than I am.
Alright, let's go!
Alright guys, let's quiet down please.
Thank you. Tefo, thank you for joining us. Okay, questions. It can be anything that we have talked about so far. Anthony, dinosaurs. Anthony, yeah.
I got a question.
Oh, Anthony's got to pull out his phone for this. Okay. All right, let's listen to Anthony's question, please.
So why did Adam and Eve dictate the sins for everyone else?
Why did they dictate the sins for everyone else?
Because they were the original human beings.
They were OGs.
No, they were not the OGs. They were the more
Do you
along
think
the
they're
lines
in
of
heaven?
BGs.
Adam and Eve?
Yeah.
No.
Do you
Yeah.
think there's like a picture of it up there?
I do.
Because
It's
they're
like
like these people.
shrines to Adam and Eve. I don't know.
Museum up in heaven that they have a picture of Adam and Eve.
So I have
Do you think you can do
no solid answers to any of those questions. Yeah. So honestly, Anthony, I don't know. I don't know why this is our Christianity's origin story. I don't know why it played out the way it did, why that was how it all came into being. That's my answer for all those questions about like why these things happen the way they do is that's the way God planned it. Yeah, Cain.
So it's kind of a New Testament question.
Okay. And You lost it?
No,
All right.
wait, I got it.
Okay.
Alright. So, here's the New Testament question.
Okay. New Testament question.
When Judas decided to betray Jesus,
No, we're going. Wait. Okay. All right.
yeah.
We're way out there. Got it. Okay. Yes.
And when he finally realized what he had done
Yes.
and decided to hang himself,
Yes.
was he condemned to go to hell then? Or did
I mean-
he basically go to heaven?
I mean, I think the story pretty much implies that he is hellbound.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I've heard people say that, oh, he was under the influence of Satan.
So, yeah, and we'll hear, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit too when we get to the Mosaic Covenant, is this idea of how Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and in some places it implies that he didn't really have a choice in that. It's kind of the same deal with Judas being sort of possessed by Satan, if that's what how you want to phrase it. The idea still is, though, and this is still kind of what theology teaches, is that somebody, a true believer, a true Christian, could not be possessed by the devil. Like that, you have to have a willingness in your heart to be deceived in that way. Yes.
Can I respond to this?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I kind of disagree with Jesus was held on. I mean,
Okay.
like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that for sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, like Jesus even told his disciples, well, one of you is gonna betray me.
Yes.
Judas even asked him, is it gonna be I? And
Mhm.
Jesus replied, yes.
Mhm.
I mean, yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, we do.
So I do think that Judas was going to go to heaven, because if he planned to.
Oh, you mean before he deceived? Like,
No, I mean like after he
okay,
in
go
general.
for it.
What I think that first off, he was going by what Jesus said. Like Jesus even I mean I don't think he wanted them to betray him. Like that's how it's supposed to happen, but
Right.
definitely wouldn't want one of my friends to get me killed. But Jesus told Judas that he was going to be the one that would betray him.
Mhm.
Judas didn't know how, or at least I don't think he did.
No, he did.
Okay, well then he did.
There was a plan already in motion by the time
Yeah. Well,
all this happened.
The 30 piece on that silver.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you got to pay 30 pieces of silver to betray the location of Judas. But I don't think that someone who planned to kill Jesus all along and would feel so guilty about it right afterwards
Mhm.
that he's like, nope, I can't deal with myself and just hang himself. Like that's, I mean, he would probably feel some guilt, but not so much to the point that he would kill himself immediately when he realized what he had done. So I think that Judas did indeed go to heaven, because not only did he recognize his mistake, but he also punished himself because Jesus, or God, because he was doing the same thing that was happening to Jesus. He was giving himself up to the Lord.
Right.
He was dying. So I do think that Judas did go to heaven, but maybe it was not so easy as it should have been.
Alright.
I think it depends based off the motive. Is there a
Okay.
difference between wanting to go to Jesus and God,
Yeah.
and there's also motive of just not wanting to be back in the Lord anymore? And I don't think the Bible really specifies which why which one. I think it leans more towards the guilt side, but.
I want to say, Kristen, do you know where? I want to say there is a verse that implies that he went to hell, but I don't know which gospel it is in. Now, and let's caveat all of this with, I have no 100% answer, and if you don't agree with my answer, that is totally fine. Do your own research. That's fine. I can't tell you who is in heaven and who is in hell. I'm not God. And I do believe that God is gracious and merciful beyond all reasoning, so very possible. I do want to say there is a verse, though, that implies that was what the deal was, but I can't think of where it is at the moment.
Fine with it. My guess is it's probably somewhere in there.
It is one of the most common questions in Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. Yeah.
Are you on Google right now?
Yes, my best
He's on
friend
Christian
Google.
Google. Get it
Oh,
right.
stop it.
Okay. While Kristen is looking at verses for us, does anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about previous to this? Anything about the covenants or creation or Abraham?
Why did God trust Judas?
Why did God trust Judas?
Good question. Follow the rules.
It's good. It's a good question. We didn't really hold up our end of the bargain, did we?
Again,
He loves us. He loves us. We dropped it huge. All right, Kristen's got something for us.
In John 17, 11, and 12, Jesus said, I will remain in the world no longer, but they are still in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them by the power of your name, the name you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one while I was with them. I protected them and kept them safe by that name you gave me. None has been lost except the one doomed to destruction, so that scripture will be fulfilled.
So, I guess that's how you read doomed. I don't know. I can't answer that 100%. My interpretation of that is that there wasn't a lot of hope for Judas recovering from betraying the Savior. That was a pretty big deal. And let's be clear, like, Judas is not innocent. Like, it would not be justice for Jesus or for Judas to go to heaven. Like, we've talked a lot about, like, God and his qualities. And one of the things that God is above all things is he is just. And a lot of times we want to make that equivalent to forgiving everything. And that's not what justice is. Justice is giving the right punishment to the right crimes, right? It's not punishing people who are innocent, but it's also not letting people who are guilty off of the hook. Neither one of those things are justice. And so, I think we could debate all day about what ended up happening to Jesus. I think that's, like I said, that's the biggest question, one of the biggest questions of Christianity. Okay, any questions about the covenants? Anything so far? Before we move on, we feel pretty, hey.
Uh-oh.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What do you mean use trouble?
We feel pretty confident that we understand the Abrahamic covenant, right? Because we're going to take a totally different direction with this next covenant, but it's important to have our basics. Yes, King.
Were the pyramids built during this time?
I think so. I think they're roughly the same time. Yeah. All right. Let's move on then. Okay. So let's take a minute and look at this chart up here. So Jacob's main wives are Leah and Rachel, and these are who most of his sons come through. Most of them are actually Leah's. Joseph, who's going to be our next main character, is Rachel's. And he is very much loved because he is Rachel's. Benjamin comes along later down the line. These four that are stuck out here, these are the maidservants' children. I couldn't fit everybody up on here, so they got kind of shoved to the side. But these are our 12 tribes of Israel, if you guys have heard that. So what happens right after all this Leah, Rachel, Jacob stuff is Jacob ends up wrestling with God. And this is a really fun story.
I've heard that story.
Yeah.
Literally? Or?
Yes, literally. So go to Genesis 32. And here we go. Jacob is literally going to wrestle with God. This is verse 32, verse 22. Sorry, I don't know if I said that right. 32 through, so chapter 32. We're going to read 22 through 32. 22 through 32.
I'll do it.
Yeah. You got it, Tyler? All right. Let's listen to Tyler, please. Wait, where are you at? 32, 22. You're in chapter 32, verse 22. Should say Jacob wrestles with God at the top. Yeah, during the night.
During the night, David got up and took his two wives, his two servant wives, and his 11 sons, and crossed the river with them. After taking them to the other side, he set over all his possessions. Wait, would I read it?
32.
Oh. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and the man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its side. Then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob." The man told him, From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name," Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" the man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place, which means face of God, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left him, and he was living because of the injury to his hip. Even today, the people of Israel don't eat the tender near the Birthright because of what happened that night when the man strangled him on Jacob's hip.
Okay. So, weird little story right here in between Jacob getting his wives and then going back to encounter his brother, because they're heading back when this happens back to the land before he kind of apologizes to Esau for what he's done. Hang on, okay. So, a few things happening here. Do you guys remember in the last class how we talked about how there is the Christological approach to reading the Old Testament, where anytime we see God appear in a man's form, he is Jesus. It's a valid way to read this if that's something that you choose to read to. Yeah. So this is not a theology that everybody adheres to, especially Old Testament scholars kind of are on the fence about this. But you can anytime. So we know that God as a man is Jesus, right? So anytime in the Old Testament that God appears as a man, you can also say that is Jesus. If he appears in a man's body, that is Jesus. So we saw that in the last story with Abraham, where the men come and tell him and Sarah that they're actually going to have their own child, and Sarah laughs, and it specifically says that one of the men is the Lord. Again, Jesus. So here, Jesus. And the whole point of this class, right, is we're seeing how everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus. And so we see these moments where, Jesus is around before Jesus is around, right? He's not just waiting to be born thousands of years later. Jesus already exists. He is already, part of the Trinity. Now, the Old Testament does not read him that way because they're not aware of this coming Messiah yet. But if this is a theory or a theology that you are interested in, do some research on it. It's pretty cool. This happens a lot through the Old Testament, but this is another one of those places where you can read this as him wrestling with Jesus. Yes?
So, Jacob, who deceived his brother twice, I can't say he deceived his brother twice, he deceived him once, and his mother deceived his brother.
He was part of the second time, yeah.
Anyway, so Jacob, whose name literally means the deceiver.
But what happens in this story?
He wrestles with Jesus.
And he changes his name.
Well, no, he gets his name changed. Jesus changes his name after. He can't be Jacob. Which I don't understand that problem, because God is God. He created the universe from nothing. Yet he can't be Jacob. Yes, but he was God in human form. There's a difference.
It's true.
I'm sure there's the bigger reason why he didn't win.
That's probably true. But still, no.
It's an interesting story, right? Why would this play out this way? I don't know. Yeah.
I have two things.
Go ahead.
Number one, about that. And you can choose to go whichever way you want to believe it, okay? But from my perspective, I kind of see it as Jacob is wrestling with God and wanting a blessing, right? And even though his name means the deceiver, or deceive, right?
Mhm.
I believe it's Jacob actually having a physical struggle as well as an inward struggle to fight off that guilt of deceiving his father and wanting to help redeem his descendants.
I think that's a good thought. Yeah, because we do see a major character change in, now his name's Israel now, was Jacob. We see that right after this, because this is when we get his apology to his brother. So we see something happens here. There is a character change, there's a physical change, because now his hip is messed up. And it's not going to get better. And this is a thing that he's going to live with as a constant reminder of the time that he wrestled with God.
What happened to your hip there?
I fought God. Yeah, and I lived. So Jacob's name is now Israel, and these are his sons. This is why we call them the 12 tribes of Israel, because they are from Jacob, who is Israel. Make sense? Is that all connecting? Here we go. Yep. So this is where our story is going to go from here. I'm going to briefly get you guys through the Joseph story. We're going to come back to the Joseph story in one of our later sessions when we're doing Bible study methods, because it's a really fun, good story, and it's good to pick apart, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it today. But what I do want you guys to look at is that even though Joseph is our next big main character, he is not the seed. You see, he's not yellow. The line to Jesus goes through Judah, who was one of Leah's sons, and that's why I've got a little. This is the royalty line.
Is that why it's called the Lion of Judah?
Yeah, no. So he's called the Lion of Judah, but then when you refer to Jesus' genealogy, it's the line of Judah. But he is called the Lion of Judah. But Judah is the royal line. We're going to see King David comes through this line, and Jesus is a direct descendant of David. And then our priests are going to come through Levi. And that's who we're going to go to with our next story after Joseph is Moses and Aaron. They come through this line here. But the next place the Old Testament goes after the story, Jacob's main story, is to Joseph. So you'll see that Joseph is, between these guys and these guys, he is the youngest son of 11 at this point, because Benjamin has not been born yet. And we get this pretty interesting story about Joseph has some dreams about how he is going to kind of rule over his brothers. And
He gets sold.
right, his brothers do not take kindly to that message, and so they sell him into slavery in Egypt. And this is how our story gets us back from that promised land that we've been in for the past several people. This is how we're getting back into Egypt, where Exodus starts. So when Joseph ends up getting sold into slavery in Egypt, through a series of wacky events, he ends up sort of being really high in command with the Egyptian Pharaoh, and ends up saving, Egypt and all the surrounding lands from this terrible famine that happens. And Joseph's family, so all of his older brothers, have to go into Egypt during this famine to get food, and that's when they realize that the brother they sold into slavery is now helping to rule Egypt. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in this story that we'll get to some other time, but what ends up happening is that Joseph stays in leadership in all of this family. So all of Jacob's sons, all of Israel's sons, their wives, their kids, they all move back to Egypt. Now, what have we learned about the people of God moving out of the land they're supposed to be in?
Bad stuff.
Bad stuff happens. So you can guarantee
We always lose.
bad stuff happens when they start wandering off the land. And if you'll remember, this is exactly what Abraham did at the beginning of his story. There was a famine in the land that God sent him to. So where did he go? He went to Egypt. And so now we're repeating the same family pattern of all of these. This whole family is now in Egypt. Yes, Matthew.
Okay. This is a very big shot in the dark right now, but
Okay.
we
I'm down
got
for
kicked out
shots
of
in the dark.
we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. No one knows where that is. There's no precise location for that.
Yeah.
But it's located.
I mean, it's
near
somewhere
the
in that general
Nile
area.
River.
Yes.
That's Egypt. The
Yes.
Nile River is in Egypt, and we keep wandering out of that promised land. Every time we keep wandering out of it's called the promised land.
Mhm.
What if that promised land is actually the Garden of Eden, but instead of it being just a garden where two people dwell? What if it's
Like in Egypt? That's why they
Yes.
keep trying to go back to it?
Yeah, we always end up coming back to the promised land, but we always lose it. So could this?
I don't know, because like I said, every time they end up in Egypt, bad things happen.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
bad things happened in Eden. We ate the forbidden fruit, and
That's true.
that's what started
That's
this
true.
whole thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would say, yeah, probably the promised land. The land that God wants them to be in is not Egypt. So,
No, I'm not saying that Egypt is the promised land. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, like, could
Yeah.
like this land just be?
like something is just pulling them back that way.
Well, I mean, not just that, but like a land that I don't want to say a land that like moves, like it just freaking gets up and walks on legs. But I mean, like the land moves, like the west part of like in one of my books I read, the Olympus, it moves like every time a new generation. There's in Western civilization,
Yeah.
is where the most current, and they moved from Olympus,
Yeah.
like Mount Olympus, to over America. Like that's the heart of Western civilization in the book. Kind of like that. I mean, it's a place where it keeps moving with the heart of
Yeah. I don't know.
God's people, like for example.
Yeah.
So like that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah.
Because that would make the most sense right now.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a good theory. Research it. Do some research on it. Let's not next time. Okay, so this is how we end up at the beginning of the book of Exodus. So about 400 years have passed between when all of these guys go to live with Joseph in Egypt and when the beginning of the story of Exodus picks up, and that's where we get to Moses, who we know from our chart he comes from that line of Levi, him and his brother Aaron. We're going to watch a real quick Bible Project video on the beginning parts of Exodus because we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the plagues and stuff like that, but I do want us to have this connection point before we get to the Mosaic Covenant.
Let's talk about the book of Exodus. Now, you're probably familiar with this book because of the epic story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt.
Yeah, but that's just the.
Let's talk about the book of Exodus.
Sorry.
Now, you're probably familiar with this book because of the epic story of Moses leading Israel out of slavery from Egypt.
Yeah, but that's just the first half of the book. And the second half has Moses giving the 10 Commandments to Israel, along with these blueprints for making a sacred tent. Now, right here in the middle is the story that connects these two halves together, and it all takes place at the foot of a famous mountain.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning.
So the first thing we have to remember is we're continuing the story from Genesis.
Yeah, in Genesis, God promised Abraham that through his family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Genesis ends with Abraham's family down in Egypt. When Exodus begins, 400 years have passed, the family grows and becomes the people group now called Israel.
But there's this huge problem because the Israelites are enslaved to this king of the Egyptians, a guy called Pharaoh.
This guy is really bad news.
Yeah, it's horrible. He disregards their humanity, he brutally enslaves them, and he even orders that all of the Israelites' sons should be killed by throwing them into the Nile River. He wants to wipe these people out. He's the worst character in the Bible so far.
Here's where we meet an Israelite woman who wants to save her son.
And so she does throw him in the river, but safely, in this little reed basket.
And Pharaoh's daughter finds this baby and takes him as her own.
And this is the boy who grows up to become Moses, the man who will rescue Israel from slavery.
So Moses grows up, and one day, much later in his life, he has this crazy encounter with God where he comes across a bush that's on fire, but it isn't actually burning up.
And God speaks from the bush, and he appoints Moses as the man he will use to deliver Israel.
So Moses goes to Pharaoh to tell him this news that God wants his people free.
And Pharaoh, he just pretty much laughs at him. Who's this God, Yahweh? And in fact, he's so offended by this request, he decides to make the Israelites work even harder.
So discouraged, Moses goes back to God and says, listen, this plan's not going to work.
But God repeats his promise that he's going to rescue them. And in fact, it's right here, for the first time in the Bible, that we hear the word redemption. It literally just means to purchase a slave's freedom. But God here uses this word to describe what he's going to do for enslaved Israel.
And God knows Pharaoh is going to resist, so he sends 10 different plagues, one after another, like turning water into blood, sending all sorts of pests and disease. These plagues are really severe.
They are severe, but we need to understand that the story is presenting these as acts of divine justice against one of the worst oppressors in the story of the Bible. And they're all aimed at the purpose of rescuing these enslaved people and defeating the gods of Egypt.
This all comes to a climax at the 10th plague, where God's going to kill the firstborn sons across all Egypt. Every house. It's pretty
That's
rough.
very graphic.
It is, but it's also got a response for how Pharaoh killed the Israelite sons.
Now as you turn the page, you suddenly get 2 long chapters of detailed instructions for what's essentially throwing a dinner party with a recipe for a lamb.
Yeah, but this lamb is super important. God tells the Israelites to pick it out and to prepare it to be eaten. And they're supposed to take its blood and then paint it all over the doorframe of their house. And anyone who is in that house will be spared from this final plague. And so this meal, which is called Passover, it commemorates this key moment in the story where God brings his justice on human evil, but also shows mercy by providing this substitute.
This final plague makes Pharaoh angry, and he demands that Israel gets out of Egypt, which is great. But suddenly, as they leave, Pharaoh changes his mind. He has a change of heart.
But on top of that, we're also told that God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Why would God do that?
Well, what we need to remember is that over and over in this story, Pharaoh has already chosen to harden his own heart. And so at this point, Pharaoh is not just evil, he's become monstrously evil. Even his own advisors think that he has gone way too far. And so how is God supposed to deal with such an extreme form of evil? And what we see in this story is that God uses his power to lure evil into its own destruction.
Pharaoh and his army are destroyed in the Red Sea as Israel passes into freedom.
And after this, we find the very first song of worship in the Bible, as people praise God for redeeming them. And it's in this story that the word salvation is also used for the first time, which means simply to be rescued from danger.
Now that they're saved, you would think that everything should be great, but the story quickly turns. The Israelites start wandering in the desert. They're tired, hungry, lost. And you start to wonder, what's God doing? What were they saved for?
And we learn the answer to that question in the very next story, which ties the 2 parts of this whole book together.
Hi, this is Tim.
And this is John.
We think one of the best ways to understand the
This is Tim.
Bible
This
is
is John.
to look at the design and message of each individual book.
That makes no sense.
Okay. So remember, the whole point of this class is to connect the dots, right? We're talking about how all of these stories are linked together. They're not separate stories. Typically, when you get taught the story of Exodus, it's usually not within the context of all the patriarchs we just talked about, right? It's kind of like pulled out to kind of just in its own little section. But this is just a continuation of the same story that we have been talking about. And this is a continuation of the Abrahamic Covenant. We are still, to this day, underneath the Abrahamic Covenant, and it is still going into effect because now we have God's people, who are now called the Israelites, living in a foreign land. And in order for God to fulfill those covenant blessings, he has to get them out of this land and back into the land that he has promised them. So we get the whole thing with the plagues. I just want to point this out because I think this is cool. We have the 10 plagues. Each of the plagues, they're not just random. God's just not like, I'm just going to send a bunch of frogs and a bunch of gnats on these people. They all have to do with gods that the Egyptians worshipped. So God's point in the plagues is to show that he is the one true God and that he is more powerful than any of the gods that they believe in. And so he sends a plague that directly attacks each of their Egyptian gods. This is kind of like roughly how they line up. You can also, like, if you Google this a little bit more, you can find some more in-depth information, but this is just like an easy. Yeah, so the plagues are very intentional, not random. Nothing in the Bible's random. And like they said, this is where Passover comes, like we get the whole like explanation of where this comes from. Passover is going to play a big deal when we get to Jesus and the New Covenant. So we will come back to that when we talk about the New Covenant, which will be in 2 lessons or 3 lessons whenever we get there. And let's see. I don't want to get us into the Mosaic Covenant because we're not going to have time to talk about it. But yeah, because I guess 10 Commandments. We'll talk about the 10 Commandments next time. So let's talk just for a minute about what we know about from these stories, from everything that we have read up until this point, because we're about to have like a kind of a major shift. This next covenant that we're moving into, it has stipulations. It is not, God, like with Abraham's covenant, God promised it is everlasting. So it's same with the Noahic covenant. Those covenants will not end until Jesus returns for the second time. The Mosaic covenant is different. It has stipulations. It can and does end, and that's how we end up in the new covenant. But it is just built on the Abrahamic covenant. So what are some things like, up to this point, if we're talking about what about God's nature has been revealed to us with these covenants so far, these stories so far, like what are some repeating things that we're seeing happening here? Okay.
Even though the humans may mess up in their plans and their covenant with God, God doesn't give up on us.
Good. Like, right. I mean, that's kind of from the get-go, we are doing everything we can to mess up God's plan. And God could have just been like, I'm done with these people. In fact, at one point, he almost did, except for Noah. Thank you for Noah.
Moses is not.
Right. Yeah. Right.
It's not like, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
These gods are the Egyptian gods who don't exist. I mean, there's one God and there's one true God, and that's the God of Christianity. He's all powerful and he's stronger than all those guys combined.
Yes.
So
What is that?
why
Oh,
do-
you? That. It's like something's about to explode. Yeah, so there are some different theories because the Bible does talk about little g gods like they are real. Or it seems that way sometimes. Now, is that because they are actually real, or is it because the people believed in them and believed them to be real? I don't know. I mean, yeah, we know that these guys are not real. I mean, we know there's one true God. But the idea in the ancient Near East was that there were tons of gods, right? We talked about this last time with Abraham. Where you lived was who you worshipped. Like, every town had its own God. Every town had its own altar, did their own sacrifices.
Heck, even every household had its own God.
Right. And then our God, Yahweh, remember a proper name Yahweh comes in, and he's like, nope, I'm the one true God. And everything that he is doing through the Old Testament is to prove that he is the one true God.
Why did God like I mean, I get that there's some debate on whether these gods are actually existed or they're like.
Right. Well, he's attacking their belief in them, right?
Yeah.
So he's attacking the Egyptian belief in the god of the Nile by turning the Nile into a river of blood. Like, if there's a god of the Nile, then shouldn't he be able to stop Yahweh from turning it into a river of blood? Now, whether he's there or not, or if God is just more powerful than him, I don't know how they interpreted that. I mean, I think we as Christians interpret it as that there is no Osiris. It's just the one true God. Okay. Anything else? All right, next lesson, we're going to talk about the Mosaic Covenant. You do have homework, which is to watch the second half of that video that we just watched that covers the back half of Exodus, and that's going to be what we're going to talk about next time is the Ten Commandments, the law. We're about to get into the law, which is lots of fun. And then after this, we're going to skip way forward in the timeline chart, and we're going to go up to the kings and talk about King David and the next major covenant. We may get into that a little bit next session, too. Any last thoughts? Okay.
What does Adonai mean?
Father? Daddy?
What?
I think it means it's almost like daddy. It's like a term of like endearment, like a father. I think it's like more than just father, though. It's like a really personal.
Because I know it's like a Hebrew term for something, or an Arabic term. I don't know. Could you agree?
I'm pretty sure it's daddy. Like, I think that's how we would interpret it in English. It's more personal than father. It's like a really close term of endearment. All right, thank you guys for listening. Pay attention. Excellent work.
Clean up your mess.
Clean up your mess.
We don't have berries here.